Speedrunners is another game I have a bit of history with, although unlike Sonic Riders or Kirby Air Ride, I've only really dabbled with this game every now and then because I didn't have my own copy. It wasn't until a friend gifted me the game so I could play with a few others where I finally got to experience the game in its entirety. So big thanks to the one friend who gifted me the game, you know who you are. I was still completely willing to buy the game for myself since Speedrunners makes for a great racing game, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. So Speedrunners is mostly known for its multiplayer gameplay, but it was originally a single player flash game back around 2013 or so. But it was a pretty solid game as far as I can tell, and I actually remember playing this once or twice back when I played flash games as a kid, although it's pretty hard to play now thanks to the shutdown of Flash. Anyways, the Flash game did well, so after an HD re-release on the Xbox 360, there was a multiplayer mode in the works, and that became the game's main appeal ever since. Okay, well, take that all with a grain of salt, because I couldn't find much on the history of speedrunners. Googling speedrunners always led to actual speedrun stuff, not the game specifically, so I'm going off educated guesses more than anything. But Speedrunners was a really popular game back in 2013. It launched in early access first, and then a handful of popular Let's Players tried it out with their friends. You had PewDiePie, Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, and a bunch of others having some fun with the game, which pushed its popularity to the moon. And it launched out of early access with great success, no doubt thanks to the influential push. It helps that the game itself is pretty cheap, even cheaper when considering the 4-pack bundle. As I said before though, I didn't really own the game back in its heyday. It wasn't until a relative got a copy on the Switch where I got to try the game for myself outside of the original Flash game. And just a few games in, everything just clicked for me. The grapple hook, sliding, the items, the momentum, and the speed of the game. I just knew this was a racing game I'd have a lot of fun with. It was so simple to understand, but with some depth and skill involved that kept me attached and attentive. I know I'm jumping the gun here, but I really do enjoy this game and still do. But I should probably get into the details to explain myself. So Speedrunners is a racing platformer where you and 3 other players try to outpace each other with a combination of items and skill. Each map loops indefinitely, but there's no finish line or laps to complete. Instead, once a player is left too far behind and hits the border of the screen, they're eliminated for the entire round. Once a player is out, the screen border begins to shrink over time, which forces everyone to try and outpace each other to be the last one standing. The screen ultimately favors the person in the lead, so they're not at risk of accidentally running too far and hitting the border themselves. The trade-off here is that the person leading has a lot less screen space to see and react to anything up ahead. So unless they've memorized where certain objects are, or maybe they're too caught up in the suspense of the match, they can end up tripping over some hazards and letting the other players catch up. The opposite is true for those left behind. They have much more screen space to work with, but are running the risk of getting too far behind and being eliminated. Every player has access to a wall jump, grapple hook, slide, and boost, which are pretty straightforward. Wall jump on dotted walls to ascend, grapple white ceilings for some height or speed, and slide through narrow tunnels to avoid slowing down. In each track, boost pads don't immediately boost you forwards, but rather fill a meter to use any time, so you can either boost as soon as you get it, or maybe save it for later. Items can also be used to help turn the tides for all players. Leading players are usually given weaker items, while those left behind are given stronger ones. Using items at the right time or place can make them stronger or weaker. Boxes may be fairly ineffective, but placing them right after a sliding path forces players to slow down. A freeze ray might be worse in open areas, but using it in narrow hallways can make it harder to avoid. Some items can also be used for other purposes. A time bomb can be used to slow down opponents, or you can set it off immediately to boost yourself. Shockwaves are great against other runners, but it can also be used to destroy or deflect items as well. Most items can also be countered if you're able to react in time and adapt accordingly. The infamous golden hook has multiple examples. You can slide under it, get out of sight from the user, drop a crate to block the grapple, or maybe use your own golden hook right after being grappled. Shockwaves can be boosted through, freeze rays can be slid or jumped over, you get the idea. All items have this extra layer of depth to them that makes them even more powerful under the right circumstances with their own counters on top of that, and that's just the items. Levels all have separate routes with their own pros and cons, with different ways to access them depending on the level design. The main routes are simpler to run through and are overall safer, while a faster path could require more skill to reach or has greater risk. Some paths close up after a player hits a switch, or a switch might open up a new path to help boost players left behind. Different routes can either act as shortcuts to get ahead, or can reward you with items and boost pads. All levels have a variety of shortcuts and routes to take, and it ultimately depends on your quick reflexes, skill, and memorization on which path to take. And memorization plays a pretty big role in every match. Map knowledge is definitely important for most racing games, but in Speedrunners it matters a lot more because of the screen borders. Once the screen starts to shrink, it gets harder to see the entire level, practically forcing you to rely on memorizing the stage's layout. It also helps to memorize the level if you're far ahead, because of the smaller screen space you'll get overall. For players falling behind, knowing certain things like what switch opens which shortcut can also be helpful for catching back up. And while map knowledge plays a big role in the game's balancing, the maps aren't too long, allowing most new players to understand a course's layout just after 1 or 2 laps. And if certain maps prove to be a bit too challenging, every course is labeled with a certain difficulty, so you can gauge how hard a level might be to play through. Another important aspect of speedrunners is momentum and slopes. When you fall from a high place, landing on slopes or grappling a ceiling can convert your vertical falling speed into horizontal running speed. This grants you access to super speed, depending on how far you've fallen. You can keep this speed as long as you avoid slowing down, but that's easier said than done. This can easily eliminate other players, since speeding up on big drops can quickly move the camera forward. While that seems a bit unfair, and honestly it kind of is with how sudden it can be, it's not too overpowered since the leading player can struggle to manage that speed for long. There's a few more tricks like grappling into wall jumps or hitting a slanted ceiling to grapple at high speeds, but just understanding the basics is more than enough to get some fun runs in. I think Speedrunners has all of its mechanics done well, and it's certainly helpful with encouraging replayability, especially due to all the maps and unlockables you get while you play. With each match, you'll get some XP based on how well you played, and earning enough will slowly unlock things like new maps, characters, and so on. The first few unlockables are always maps and items, which is a good way to keep players interested, but I'm not sure why items are locked away. There isn't much items to unlock, and to keep things fair between all players, wouldn't it be better to have them available from the start? Either way, you'll unlock all items and maps after a few hours. The rest of the unlocks are either cosmetic or just not as important. But by that point, unlocking things gets slower and slower, which starts to lean less on replayability and more on grinding XP, which kinda drags. I've played the game for about 13 hours and I'm only level 10. I've seen some posts of people playing the game for 100 hours and still didn't reach the max level cap. It doesn't help that certain things outright restrict XP gain, like workshop levels or solo runs, which means you have to play on base game maps to get some progress. At the very least, game modifiers can change things up for a while. Game modifiers are pretty self-explanatory. They modify the game in a drastic way, like having rockets rain down endlessly or increasing the speed of everyone. The workshop maps also add some good variety to keep things fresh, since there's countless amounts of user-made maps out there. I only tried a handful of them, but most of them were pretty good. Some even require different movement and actions that the base game never utilizes, alongside workshop exclusive objects like bounce pads. You can also create your own maps, although I didn't do much with it because I'm not willing to build a whole level for about 30 seconds of footage. There's also a solo run mode, where you can run through any course by yourself and try and beat your own time through one loop of the level, but it's pretty lackluster in execution. Items are still present, so runs can be unfairly skewed based on luck, and even after disabling them, the timer only tracks for 1 lap. So if you pass the finish line and start your best lap at high speed, that means resets will always start you at a disadvantage because you start at a standstill. To be fair, that's what the game is designed around, but I'd appreciate having an option for a 3-lap structure so I wouldn't have to worry about that. But for what it's worth, most of these extra features give the game a bit more variety and helps it from getting too stale. In combination with its deeper mechanics, it makes Speedrunners a really fun game in my eyes, but it's not a perfect game by any means. A big problem I have is that some of the shortcuts and faster routes aren't actually faster than the simpler main route. The best example is the start of the library level. There's a high path that needs some grapples, which skips a bit of wall jumping by the end. But most of the time, running on the ground and taking the normal path is faster than taking the harder, higher path. There's a few parts like that over a few of the courses, and I feel they needed some adjusting to really make the extra effort pay off. The game is also a bit clunky sometimes. Getting stuck at the corner of a wall jump can be tough to recover from, and you can have some weird interactions with ceilings or the grappling hook. It can easily lead to a loss that feels undeserved, but those moments are few and far between. The weighty physics of your character can also be annoying to deal with, especially if you mess up your wall jumps, trying to reset yourself mid-air, and end up falling to your death because you wall jumped the wrong way. Spikes are meant to stun you for a bit after landing in them, but you can find yourself stun locked if you fall in with no speed. At that point, it's a guaranteed loss. And although most stages give a good sense of direction for any first-time players, there is a small chance to be confused on where to go, especially if the path forward can be hard to see. The border can sometimes not kill you despite clearly being in it. Some game modifiers can lead to unintended effects or even confirmed deaths with something like the golden skins. CPUs can get confused and stuck even on the highest difficulty, and thrown items still exist between rounds. Although that does lead to some fun moments, so I don't know if that's intentional or not. Either way, the game's got some weird quirks, which makes sense given the game's origins as an old Flash game. But it's not enough to bring down the experience. If anything, something odd might randomly happen to you every now and that's it. And although it might not matter much, the tutorial is pretty cheaply made. It's just the Metro map with easy CPUs and text on the walls telling you what they do. It works, I guess, but I feel like it could be better, especially given the deeper mechanics of the game. But I guess story mode kinda does that part. Story mode is the main single-player campaign, but it's pretty shallow both in story and in gameplay. It's just 4 different rivals challenging Speedrunner to a race, but the stakes are non-existent, there's no major final boss, and after the 4th chapter, it just ends with no real conclusion. Gameplay wise, it's just a race against CPUs and your current rival, with the last race being a 1v1. So it's basically normal matches against CPUs, which I can already play. The only difference is the dialogue and quote-unquote story that the mode has, which really doesn't offer much. I guess the dialogue helps as tips for new players? I mean, it's pretty telling that they're tips. The subtlety is practically non-existent. But as someone who already knows all this stuff, I wonder if this and the tutorial were actually effective in teaching new players how the mechanics work. They say things like hitting these slopes will boost me, but will a new player be able to understand the slope mechanics just from dialogue? For a story mode, both gameplay and story-wise, I feel this could have been better. There's no unique mechanics or gimmicks, no special challenges, not even cutscenes. The best thing you can get are these backstory comics for the rivals, which are neat, but very inconsequential. And I'm sorry if this comes off as rude to the artists, but these look pretty bad. See, here's the thing. I mentioned before that Speedrunners started out as a single-player Flash game, and that was a pretty good campaign with its own comics telling its simple story. It had a consistent, solid art style that complemented the game's classic superhero aesthetics. So when you go from that to this, it's a jarring difference. The art now follows the same style of animations from the game's trailers and portraits. And while it looked good for the animations, it doesn't look as good for still pictures. They tried to add some shading and more detail to make it look less rough, but it just doesn't work. Why ditch the old comic style to begin with? Especially considering they had the original story mode in comics during early access, so I don't understand the changes. Also, is Speedrunner a bad guy in these? He's saving people and all, but he disrupts other heroes from doing the same thing, and he's even placing bombs around the city to keep the advantage. To be fair, I don't think I'm meant to take it very seriously. It's definitely self-aware to a certain degree, and it's not hard to laugh at the absurdity of some moments, but the rest of the comics are just okay. I mentioned that Speedrunners did have the original story mode during early access, which actually had the original Flash game levels remade as the main single-player campaign. But once the game launched out of early access, it was swapped out with the one we have now. But with how important the original Flash game was to Speedrunners and its history, I feel having the Origin story mode locked away wasn't the best move. Not to mention, the Flash game mode actually had original levels instead of being simple CPU matches in normal levels. Honestly, why not include the original Flash game itself while you're at it? It has its own physics and differences, and it'd probably be great to have as an unlockable extra or something. But who knows if they even have the original game code anymore. It has been over a decade since it was released. The last thing I should cover gameplay-wise is the online mode. Playing online for this game was definitely a no-brainer, and I think the overall network stability was more than passable when I played it with friends, and that's without rollback netcode, probably because it didn't exist back then. But going into public lobbies, I expected to leave empty-handed. The game's got a small community, but with the numbers going into the low hundreds, I wasn't very hopeful. After about 15 minutes of waiting in ranked and quick match lobbies, I found a player with 2 bots, but the player was AFK. So queuing up for 10 more minutes, I did find a real player who put up a good challenge, but it was strictly a 1v1. So going into ranked, I actually found a match pretty quickly. It started as a 1v1, then slowly grew to a 4-player lobby. Although, given that it was ranked mode with not many players online, it was inevitable that some higher ranked player would come in and win every game effortlessly. The movement of this guy was impressive, but it was genuinely impossible to try and live for more than 5 seconds. But I'm just glad some players queued up and gave a good challenge. There are longer than normal queue times, but it's still somewhat possible to find public matches online. The game's got a small dedicated community as far as I know, so it's good to know that some people are still playing it. The only bad part of online is that climbing the ranks is now a large time sink, and skill-based matchmaking is pretty skewed as a result, so good luck trying to work with that. Anyways, I think Speedrunners is really great when it comes to its gameplay. While its foundation of being a Flash game can still be felt, most of the game is stable and more than playable both online and offline. It's definitely a better game with friends or random people online, since that human element can make interactions a lot more interesting with items and movement. You'll definitely run into a few smaller problems, but there's nothing that'll ruin the game for you. What helps add to the experience is the music, which I think Speedrunners also does well with, but I kinda wish they had a bit more tracks. Not only are the compositions great on their own, but the music switches to a more suspenseful version once someone gets eliminated. It just heightens that tension of trying to keep up with each other and surviving for as long as you can. The whole OST is reminiscent of tracks you'd probably hear from superhero films, but with an added kick and tempo to complement the quick action of the game. I only have 2 issues. One is that the amount of tracks is very small. There's a menu theme and then 4 tracks for all stages, with second parts when someone is eliminated. Now I think only having 4 tracks is just barely enough from keeping the music from being repetitive. But I also wouldn't mind having a 5th or 6th track play either. My second issue is that the tracks have a chance of not looping properly, so it just awkwardly repeats the track sometimes. And visually, it's also mostly great with no major problems. Backgrounds and characters look nice, and while the flat black tiling of the levels can seem a bit cheap, I think it helps with readability during gameplay, because what's important is usually a different color that stands out a lot more. Walls and grapple ceilings are white, item pickups and boost pads are blue, crates are tinted with some red, and lasers are bright orange. Thanks to the simple coloring, level design is never confused with background elements, and items from other players will immediately stand out once used, helping with overall clarity. The character variety is definitely appreciated, and even some popular YouTubers are playable through DLC. But a small discrepancy I've noticed is that some characters look hand animated, while others look smooth and rotoscoped. It's mostly noticeable when jumping with different characters. It doesn't look bad, it's just a small inconsistency when you see a different animation with a different style. Different colors can also be unlocked for every character, and having something like the golden suits are nice rewards that also provide a small handicap if you're looking for a challenge. But unfortunately, golden suits are locked behind high levels, which means grinding for XP just to get access to one golden skin. I didn't even know about them until I was capturing footage, which shows how long I've played the game without even knowing about them. Still though, it's a cool unlock that offers a neat test of skill. I already mentioned the rough looking comics, so I won't go over that again, but I do wish the animated launch trailer was some sort of opening for the game. I know it's kinda aged a bit, but unlike the comic art, I find the rougher animation charming given how reminiscent it is of older Flash animations. Speedrunners looks great for what it sets out to do, and while it may seem a bit flower basic from a first look, the clean and simple art direction helps with gameplay readability and lacks any real problems. As it is now, Speedrunners is definitely worth playing for yourself, even more so with friends. It's a great competitive racing game that's simple to learn, but difficult to master. There's a good amount of maps, unlockable items, characters, modifiers, and a small online community that's still partially present. And if that wasn't enough, there's a bunch of custom levels made by other players, which basically expands the game's content tenfold. There's still a bit of issues present like the lukewarm story mode, grindy XP system, and occasional gameplay oddities, but those are pretty small problems that will rarely hamper the game's qualities. At the low cost of $15, I think the game's well worth it, but I'd also recommend waiting for one of the many sales the game goes on, which lowers the price to about $3. In fact, there's a sale going on right now at the time of writing this, which I think is entirely worth it. So if you're in no rush, it's best to wait for those sales. There's also the 4-pack bundle on Steam if you're getting the game with 3 other people, so that's even more savings stacked on top. And while the game is on every platform from the 8th console generation, there's no crossplay between different consoles or PC players, so keep that in mind if you're playing with others online. Workshop content also isn't available outside of Steam, so if you're looking for the best value, it'll be the Steam version. But the gameplay and base content is completely identical across all platforms. Just some minor differences I felt were important to cover. Regardless of what you're playing on, Speedrunners is a great racing platformer that I think most people should try out. And it'll be the perfect practice for the upcoming Speedrunners 2, which is coming out this year. While it might be safer to wait for Speedrunners 2 instead of buying the first one now, it's so insanely cheap half the time that there's no real harm in getting it on sale now. How the sequel will fare against its predecessor will be seen in due time, but with a confirmed tournament mode and an increase to 8 players per match, it seems like an interesting continuation of the nearly decade-old title. I'm hoping that it still keeps most of the first game's features while improving on its weaker aspects. I'd love to see a better story mode with unique gameplay aspects, and a better tutorial that explains the game's more technical mechanics. Other things like crossplay, rollback netcode, and a bit more music would also be nice features to add. And current info seems to indicate that work on these features are in progress, but we'll see the results for ourselves soon enough. Anyways, that's everything I wanted to cover. Be sure to like, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff, or don't, that's up to you, and I'll see you later.